Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this per capita webinar with Lech Blaine about his quarterly essay, which if you haven't read by now, I don't know why not, Top Blokes, the Larrikin Myth, Class and Power. I'm Emma Dawson. For those of you who haven't met me before, I'm Executive Director here at Per Capita, and I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and recognise their custodianship of this land over generations and their care for the lands and waters that surround us, lands which were never ceded. And wherever you are, I know you're joining us. You'll join me in welcoming any traditional owners that join us today and paying respects to the owners of the lands on which you are. This essay by Lech Blaine is one of the best in the series that I've read, and I've subscribed since day one, so I'm really looking forward to getting into it with him. Before I do so, please be aware that we are recording this session and it will be made available as a Per Capita podcast. If you would like to ask a question, please post your question in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we will read those questions out. I'll get to as many of them as I can on your behalf. We'll have plenty of time for discussion later on in this hour. But now, Lech, I'd like to ask you, starting off with, what made you want to write this terrific essay?
All the stuff in the essay has been percolating in some ways for my entire life. Like this is, it's stuff that I've picked up and noticed, and even not on an intellectual level, but just stuff that has sort of been there. And then obviously as I grew up and started to pay a little bit more attention to politics and to literature, and then to, my experiences as an adolescent and as an adult, then just over the past sort of decade leading up, it's all just been bubbling away. And so I went down a lot of rabbit holes. There's probably a million more rabbit holes that I could have gone down. But one thing that has sort of been a constant throughout this period is a sense of these personas that get used in Australia. And I grew up in pubs in country Queensland, and I grew up around a lot of larrikins. I think my dad was a fair bit of a larrikin, and a lot of that traditional sort of working class larrikin. And then, as I started writing more about politics and went to university, and I started to notice the way that these personas were being weaponized by people with quite a bit of power, quite a bit of money, and that they were tapping into these same sort of mannerisms and myths, and then that sort of I actually mentioned as a joke to my editor for the quarterly essay, Chris, a few years ago, who's also my editor for the memoir that I was writing, that I'd love to write a quarterly essay about larrikinism, and that was probably about a year before Scott Morrison became Prime Minister. So Scott Morrison came along and sort of really crystallised everything that I've been thinking about, the way that Conservatives used this traditional ideas about who Australians are, and especially this idea of like the bloke, and the way that he just wrapped all that up really neatly into a single persona and then won an election. And I wanted to retrace the entire history of it, but I also wanted to focus on Scott Morrison himself, and not just Scott Morrison or what he did, but what it is that made that possible, what it is that made people from not traditionally liberal backgrounds sympathise with this character. It's not just a matter of Scott Morrison playing like Jedi mind tricks on people. There is like he's filling a gap within Australian politics, so I didn't just want to attack him. I also wanted to think really deeply about progressive politics and the sort of patterns in progressive politics that have led to this moment as well.
I think it's one of the things the essay does really well. You go back and look at the history of larrikinism in power, not just in politics, but with people like Kerry as well, and how that persona became quite a dominant persona is the only word for it, really, isn't it? Something that men in power took on to kind of dilute the feeling that they were powerful and to try to be an everyman. One of the interesting things to me is how you trace that trajectory, and through what Bob Hawke did with the same sort of persona in the 80s, and how you connect that to the development that over time and what the Morrison has become. When you were growing up, and you say, you know, your dad, Thomas, was a larrikin, do you reckon that the early days of that adoption of that persona by people in power was well received by authentic larrikins, or did you think that it was something that was even then seen as a bit of a try-on?
Well, it's interesting because Dad's best mate Bruce, he blew up about Bob Hawke in the essay, but my dad, by the time Hawke was in power, he was a small businessman, so he didn't feel probably jilted about what happened to the trade union movement because he was no longer a member of the union. So he loved Hawke. I'd ask him who was better out of Hawke and Keating, and he'd say, well, who would you rather have a beer with? And so
that's a key thing, isn't it, for Australians? Who would you rather have a beer with? And I think that we were talking just before we started that Keating was almost the anti-Hawke in a way, in that he came from a working class background but consciously moved away from that.
Yeah, they were both. It's a fascinating sort of like asymmetrical type thing where they both sort of had this part of themselves that the other wanted, which was Hawke's had this really educated side, and Keating had this real working class sort of authenticity and that sort of traditional Labor Catholic, Irish Catholic sort of base. And so yeah, I think that those two just being in by virtue of where they arrived in time, Keating became sort of a reaction against Hawke, and then once Keating got voted out, and that's one of the interesting things is that my perception, because I was born in '92, so I've got no memory of all this taking place, but my perception had always been that Labor started losing working class voters because Paul Keating wore nice suits and all this sort of stuff, and that was one of the really interesting things that I challenged within my own sort of writing of the essay, was realizing that that drift actually started happening in the 80s, and it was because of what was happening with the Accord. And so, yeah, I think that Keating, it wasn't just his persona. I think that by the time that he got voted out, Labor had been in power for so long. So I think maybe his own personal tendencies have become overemphasized as like the cause of Labor's malaise. I think that you can't like escape that it had some effect, but I think that there were much broader sort of structural like causes of that happening. Whether I'm sure that the people who did that would argue that they were worth it, that Australia's prosperity was worth what happened to the union movement. And so, but I think it was really interesting to sort of deconstruct my own kind of biases about what had happened.
Yeah, and I think it comes through really well in the essay that you've done that, actually, because so you were born in '92, so I'm 20 years older than you. So when you were born, I was finishing uni. But I think one of the things that has long frustrated me is that this perception that working class people retreated from the Labor Party because Paul Keating wore suits, rather than because of the material changes to their working conditions that came about through the 1980s and the deregulation of the economy, has meant that it's too easy for the press gallery and those that comment on politics to put it down to that very simplistic cultural rejection of Keating as a person rather than of the agenda. And then, of course, we had Howard, who was almost, I think, deliberately the anti-Keating in a lot of ways. We'll be relaxed and comfortable. Let's let go of this big vision thing. Morrison, though, is really the only larrikin PM that we've had in that mould since Howard. You know, Rudd couldn't be called a larrikin. He was far too nerdy for that. And so it's almost like I think he's reaching back to a sense of leadership style that he thinks people are comfortable with.
Yeah, I don't think that Morrison's a larrikin. Like he doesn't have any sense of humour, so that sort of precludes him somewhat from. But he definitely taps into that identity in certainly the imagery and the footy and the beer and just the way that he talks about mateship. It's and it's really effective because it does tap into an idea that a lot of people across the country have about Australian identity. And yeah, it's like, but that was the interesting thing, as I said, when I interviewed my dad's mate Bruce, son of a coal miner, now works on a gas mine from Ipswich in Queensland, very working class, and he loved Gough Whitlam and thought that Bob Hawke was a complete poser. So he's exactly the sort of person. He actually talks quite a lot like Bob Hawke, he probably has a lot of the same. Might have a little bit of the same sort of drinking problem, but he loved Whitlam. So sometimes we look too much at like what working class people want, as if they want to just be mimicked, rather than someone who can really encapsulate like the social progress of the people that they know and their families and that sort of thing.
I think that's an excellent point. And my own dad, very working class dad, had the same kind of attitude, that Hawke seemed like a good bloke, but was a bit cringy. You know, he wanted somebody with a vision and with more authority, and that understood the real lives of the people that they're meant to represent. It is a traditional thing in Australian history, is the larrikin or the bloke, but we've kind of got to the point now where it's all kind of surface and no substance. And I want to talk about what's happened in the week since your essay came out, because we've seen, of course, Morrison go through a fairly torrid time, be accused of being a liar on the international stage. And I think what we're seeing now is he's moving right into campaign mode, and that campaign performance that he took on last time is starting to come to the fore again. Do you think it will work as effectively as it did in 2019?
No, I don't think that the anti-politician sort of pose can work, like just by virtue of the fact that he's been Prime Minister now, and he's been probably a more integral part of people's daily lives than the average Prime Minister because of coronavirus. So people are very aware of who he is and the amount of power that he has. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to lose. It just means that he won't be able to rely. He's going to need to rely on his incumbency, which is a complete opposite of what he was trying to do last time, which was really setting himself adrift from the Liberal Party, from his predecessors. He was sort of this lone wolf. I don't think that's going to work. I don't necessarily think it's going to be because of Macron calling him a liar. I think that I don't think that's going to translate at all. The one way that it might have an effect is that it's legitimized calling him a liar or calling him out on his bullshit, which didn't happen very much before the last election because people expected him to lose. And so it's been quite noticeable already, the way that journalists have started to really call him out on stuff quite stridently, which I don't really remember happening. So I don't think that people are going to be thinking of the French president when they go to cast their vote, but it certainly might change the complexion of the campaign and the way that the media treat Scott Morrison. And certainly it allows Labor to call him a liar in a way that doesn't seem hysterical, because they're sort of relying on Macron, they're relying on Malcolm Turnbull. They're not sort of, it would seem a little bit over the top if it just came out of nowhere.
Yes, yep, I agree. I want to delve a bit more into the concept of class, even outside politics, because that's really what your essay is about, is how we understand class in Australia, who is working class, who identifies that way. And there's become, I think, there's been a strong resistance for a long time to talking about class in Australia over the last 30 to 40 years. People don't want to think of themselves as working class, or if they do, it's just such a part of their identity that they don't focus on that issue. The people that tend to try to stratify us into groups tend to be people with a reasonable amount of privilege. What I really liked about your essay is that, you talked about your brother, John, and Bruce and others, and they're not a stereotype. They're real people with quite sophisticated understanding of their place in the world and of their place in the Australian economy. And yet our public discourse kind of lumps people into their regional voters, or they're people that are susceptible to one nation, or what we tend to dismiss them as two-dimensional characters, rather than people that make an informed choice about how they relate to our society. I've got a thesis that and it's being challenged by people like you and Rick Morton and others that are coming and writing and entering journalism and coming from that working class background, but that we've got quite an insular media and political class that doesn't really understand the real diversity of working class Australia. And what you do in this essay so well is point out that the white larrikin is not the typical representative of working class Australia today, that working class Australia is very diverse, and the people from non-English speaking backgrounds, recent immigrants, First Nations Australians, women who are left out of this blokey larrikin myth, who are not captured by that, but are actually, hugely part of working Australia and the people that have kept us going through this pandemic. How do you think we challenge that idea, and how do we rediscover the solidarity of class that doesn't, when we've got such a myth that excludes so many people? I think we've frozen.
Sorry.
Back. Hi. We're having some connectivity issues, I think. Let's see if we can get Lech Black back. I think you've gone on mute. There we go. Hi. How much of that did you catch?
I got the part about the white larrikins.
Yep. So
and the trajectory, like the media ecology of working class journalists and that sort of thing.
Yep. And then I was just going on to say that a lot of people that are part of our working class in 21st century Australia, Indigenous Australians, immigrants, and people of colour, women, are not part of this myth, of this larrikin myth, and yet they are the front lines of our working class today. So how do we get beyond this idea that the true Aussie bloke is the epitome of, salt of the earth Australian working class culture, when the majority of working class people now are, hugely diverse. We're hugely diverse in our culture and identity.
Yeah, well, it's class very strategically became a taboo issue within Australian society. That was a war sort of fought by the Liberals, and I think that it started to become a taboo issue for progressives as well, because the whole sort of class structure of progressive politics changed, and it became convenient for both conservatives and progressives not really to talk about class. I've got a very complex class background. I certainly wouldn't call myself working class. I've never, by the time that I was a teenager, my parents were comfortable and they owned small businesses and investment properties. So I wasn't like I haven't had to struggle. Certainly not in the way that my extended family did, because my parents were from quite working class backgrounds. But I'm pretty as I said, I wouldn't want to claim that identity. But I think that there is that's another part of this whole argument and debate, is that class is so complex, and I think that that's one of the things that I wanted to be upfront about in the essay, was that my parents' financial position changed, but there was certainly still a social class that they didn't really belong to, which was the middle class. Like they couldn't ever possibly belong to that. They didn't look right. They didn't sound right. They didn't have an education. They didn't, just all those little things, which sort of precluded them from ever really feeling comfortable in that sort of domain, and that even followed me to a certain extent. And I, as I said, I've had a pretty comfortable life, and so the fact that I feel self-conscious about this stuff is like an eye-opener, because they're like, if you it's only my social mobility that has allowed me to feel uncomfortable about this. And so I just wanted to have a really open conversation about that, because I think it is important, and I think that it is something that doesn't really get talked about, and that's been for the betterment of the conservatives in Australia. They've even though they don't want to talk about class, they know exactly how it operates, and they've used it really well to their advantage. And certainly John Howard, for all of his talk about class envy and the politics of envy and all that sort of thing, he knew exactly how class worked, and he was using a lot of that to his advantage to try and attract working class voters to the Liberal Party.
I agree with that, and I think what you touched on there's the fundamental question for me, which is you don't identify as working class because you were raised in material comfort, as was I. I was raised in a comfortable middle class lifestyle with parents from a working class background. But as you've alluded to, class is about much more than how much money you have right today or right now, because of those social markers, those things that your parents would never be able to access the right way of talking, the right educational background, the connections that you make growing up. And I think that it's a challenge, I think, for progressive politics to recognise that, and progressive politics has very much been afraid to talk about class in Australia. They've kind of capitulated on the Conservatives' ground, if you like, and Howard got those Howard battlers to, you know, become small businessmen and become part of the Liberal family. The challenge then surely is, how does the progressive side build enough solidarity across quite a disparate group of people now to have a real electoral basis? And that's been a challenge, I think, not just here but around the world, in Western democracies since neoliberal politics and economics. In Australia, one of the things that Jeremy Corbyn did in the UK was to really redefine the working class, and they did a lot of media and advertisements and so on, showing the diversity of the working class, of who they were. They were nurses and frontline workers and from all kinds of backgrounds. But until Australia's still not willing to have that conversation, it seems to me, just as we're not willing to have the conversation openly about class being a form of diversity.
Well, yeah, it happens in reverse as well, like that a lot of people who technically are now working class would never consider themselves that, and because it doesn't fit within this traditional narrative about who is working class. And so you have a lot of voters, especially like your high vis sort of voters, who have been on really good wages and salaries now for a long period of time, and actually have like quite significant investments, have quite high disposable incomes, and they consider themselves working class and still play the class card a lot. And then you have teachers, nurses, even a lot of cleaners, and a lot of what you would, you know, where it doesn't fit within that sort of larrikin identity. It doesn't fit within the working class man that, you know, Jimmy Barnes was singing about, which is you know, diverse women in Western Sydney. That's sort of like that's just as working class as this other idea. And yeah, it's really hard to articulate that as a political party, because class has become such a taboo subject that once you start even going down that rabbit hole, then it becomes shouted down as the politics of envy, as and used to scare people about what Labor wants to do. And so yeah, it's a pretty tough balancing act, and that's why, you know, I don't begrudge Albanese for like how hard it is to pay homage to like the reality of what's happening within the electorate, but also to try and win elections.
Yeah, and that's something that you do note, I think, with some understanding in your essay. And you also compare ScoMo and Albo in the essay, and along the lines of authenticity. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I grew up in Queensland and came from a very devout rugby league household and family, and a lot of my extended family were decorated rugby league players, and so I always, like, as soon as Morrison started putting on the Sharks kit, like I called bullshit straight away, because I knew I had this dual interest in politics as well, so I knew his actual background. I knew where he came from and what sport he supported, but again, it seems like a trivial thing, so it's kind of hard for people to call out, because it's like, well, it's not really that important. But the reason I explored it was because I thought it was symptomatic of the broader way that the Liberal Party have made class a taboo subject while using the symbols of working class culture to win elections. And so I think that it actually had a really tangible effect on the way that Morrison was received by the electorate. I think if he had have showed up and presented himself as what he is, which is a diehard rugby union fan, I don't think the ScoMo persona would have worked. People would have gone, well, you're technically no different to Malcolm Turnbull, then you're just a toff from the eastern suburbs. But this gave him a real sort of suburban authenticity out of suburb, where it's not even that. Rugby league has changed quite a bit. It's not a purely working class sport anymore, but it really tapped into this idea that he was an outsider. He was at one with these voters who sometimes feel like they're being looked down upon or condescended to by the media and by politicians.
Yeah, I think the difference, I think a lot of what the media missed about the difference between the 2016 election and the 2019 election was the lack of appeal of Malcolm Turnbull outside the capital cities or outside the very educated class. And actually Morrison rolling him was seen as a disaster at the time by a lot of very informed commentators, but out in the burbs and the regions where people don't live and breathe politics because they're too busy working 5 jobs, right? Then Morrison was more like them. And that, as you said, silver tongue image that Turnbull brought, which didn't, was a much easier contest for Bill Shorten against Malcolm Turnbull than it was against Morrison.
Yeah, and like journalists loved Turnbull and also Abbott to a certain extent, because they were both very like they were ex-journalists and they very much loved to play the game of politics and all that sort of thing. And yeah, Morrison just completely rejected all of that. He doesn't do interviews unless he needs to. He doesn't talk too like he doesn't talk too much. He keeps it very short. He's very simple, and people really cringed at him. But there was certainly something really effective to what he was doing, and that's why someone like my brother John, who loved John Howard, never connected with Abbott or Turnbull in the same way, and then was suddenly Scott Morrison's biggest fan. And so all of the imagery, all of the semantics of what he was doing had a really immediate effect, which even I, as someone whose brother was like Scott Morrison's biggest fan, still didn't think that it was going to work. I was wrapped up in the conclusions of the political and media class as well, and yeah, it turns out that he was right and I was wrong.
Well, it's taken our media class in particular a long time to get a handle on Morrison for that reason, hasn't it? Because he doesn't play the game. He's deliberately said, well, I'm not playing by your rules, you will play by my rules. Dan Andrews does it in Victoria as well in a very different way, but he sets the rules by which he engages, and that has been a real challenge for the media, not only to understand his appeal beyond their own class, but to understand how he can circumvent the traditional games that previous politicians have played quite willingly.
Yeah, I think as I said, Morrison it produces it has two dual effects. It a lot of the way how he communicates, it both appeals to a certain group of people, then it provokes sort of like mockery from another group of people, which then actually further entrenches his appeal to that other group of people that he's talking to. And so when he does stuff which people go, oh, how dumb is that? And he can't possibly be that moronic. Like he knows what he's doing, and it's partly to provoke that response. It's partly to it's partly to be mocked and scorned by a certain group of people, and that makes him more popular amongst the people who tend to decide elections.
Yeah, he's called his own party a Muppet show, and I'm not part of this Canberra bubble. And how much, though, do you think that's beginning to come unstuck? I'd be really interested to hear what John thinks of Scott Morrison now compared to when you were writing the essay, for example.
I think John personally has lost faith with all politics, and so he didn't have much faith to begin with. But I think that that's a symptom of the fact that he doesn't hate Scott Morrison or anything like that, but he's certainly not a Scott Morrison disciple anymore. And so I think that is just a symptom of the fact that he's been in power now for quite a period of time. He's been such a prominent part of people's lives throughout that period, and yeah, I think that it's if that spreads, and which it seems like it is, like it just based on certainly not just on the polls, but on the broader polls, but on the sort of breakdown around issues of trust. I think there is going to be a genuine sense by the time we get to the next election that this guy's been in power for quite a while, and the Liberal Party has been in power for even longer, and that could have that could start to build up into a genuine desire for change above and beyond anything that the Labor Party actually offers in terms of policies.
Yeah, and as we know, it tends to be governments that lose rather than oppositions that win is the classic wisdom. Can I just remind everyone, if you do want to put a question to Lech, please post it in the Q&A. There's a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. That's where we are taking questions from shortly. I just want to, before I do throw to some questions from our guests today, come back to the challenge for progressive politics. Per Capita is a progressive think tank. I read, David Brooks, who's not a particularly progressive thinker in the US, though, wrote a recent article for The Atlantic where he talked about the Bobos. And what he's talking about is that the offspring, the children of the creative classes that emerged in the 70s and 80s and 90s have become, in a way, their own class that's not about money so much as it is about cultural capital, and so much as it is about having read the right books, having gone to the right school, that we have now, a generation of very highly educated young people who may be on relatively low incomes, even working in the university sector on insecure jobs. So their income would match that of previous working class societies, but their cultural capital is very middle and upper class, and that in its own way is used as a class marker to sort of exclude people that don't get that language, that don't understand the cultural signals. And you talk in your essay about when you went to university and felt you didn't have that cultural capital, and Rick Morton said the same thing. I sort of experienced that when I went to university as well. How do progressives hold on to the important things about that culture, about being anti-racist, being feminist, being inclusive, being concerned about the environment, all of those things that are seen in some circles as elite preoccupations, but are actually fundamental to social justice politics? How do we hold on to those beliefs and bring people with us so that they're not consistently voting against their own economic self-interest? It's only a small question, Lech, that everyone's been grappling with for generations. So I'm going to get you to fix it.
Just firstly, with the whole Bobo thing, yeah, I found that fascinating. And I didn't really go there in the essay because I didn't want to, I didn't want to really analyze writers, because like writers aren't deciding elections. But yeah, the interesting thing about the whole me and my brother type thing is that he identifies as an outsider, but he's actually part of the political majority, and he also earns significantly more money than I do. Like he's done well for himself. Like he's not.
My brother-in-law's a truckie. He earns more than I do. Right?
Yeah. So he earns by quite a multitude, a lot more money than I do as a writer. So I have some cultural capital. Like I can't deny that, like because of through writing or whatever. But yeah, I'm by doing that, I'm very much at risk of reversing the class progress that my father made and actually ending back up in like a fairly precarious sort of place. So yeah, that's like another very interesting tangent of the whole class thing, is even within my own family. In terms of the broader question about progressives, well, it's like as you said, that you can't waver on those core principles in terms of racial equality, and in terms of embracing the progress that we've made. And so it can't be a race to the bottom. There are things that are that can't sort of be wavered on. But I think it's just, I think that there's been a shift between the two parties, where I think that conservative parties or the traditional Liberal Party, they were less at one period in time, they were less concerned about winning than about maintaining a certain sense of moral superiority, and Labor parties or social democratic parties were very much about winning, gaining power, and exercising power. And so I think that's reversed somewhat, and I think that it's not so much about this one single issue that's going to win Labor elections or anything like that. I think it's really just the approach to politics and the approach to the sort of people that you're willing to embrace to gain majorities and win elections. Like to win the next election, Labor will need people who voted for Scott Morrison at the last election. They'll need people who voted for Pauline Hanson at the last election. Like that's the reality. Like there's no escaping that. That doesn't mean that Labor should just take wholesale the positions of those parties or of those people, but it's like a basic awareness about the way that you communicate about certain issues and whether that's going to appeal to someone who is quite socially conservative. And it's and if you don't do that, well, then you're just never going to win elections. That's the reality. As I said, Labor shouldn't just be in a race to the bottom with the Liberal Party, especially on those important social issues. But it's really about tone, I think, and even if you're pragmatically not shifting on those things, it's about being in a conversation with people rather than any sense that you're lecturing them, and sometimes those lectures can be really well meaning, but they actually they rub people really badly, because they can sniff it from a mile away that you're patronizing them and that you're trying to sell yourself down. And so that's why it's so hard to do this, because a lot of the people who are trying to sell these messages are career politicians, are university educated. So how do university educated people communicate? and as soon as you start thinking that way, then the level of self-consciousness becomes like and you see it with so many politicians where they lose the ability to communicate. So it's extremely difficult, but I think it's just bringing it all back to that basic humanity and seeing these voters that you need to win as humans with very complex views and very complex needs.
Yeah, well, there's takes us a nice segue to some of the questions coming from the floor. I'll still call it the floor, even though we're on Zoom, which Victoria Collins has asked: do you believe that Anthony Albanese does project to the electorate as a genuinely good bloke, or do you think he's still got challenges in that regard?
I don't think he's projected that. I don't think he's really reached a lot of the people who will decide the next election. I think that they are basically not really aware of him. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that that's partly by design. The difference being with other elections is that I had a genuine sense, just through my social media network and being friends with so many people from Queensland and regional Queensland, is that Labor were just constantly getting hammered. And there's no real sense of that. The risk of that is if you're not offering anything, well then you sort of, what's the point? So I think that there will be a shift, especially as we get closer to the campaign, where he will take a more leading role. There will be more policies announced, certainly, so that's going to change things. But I think on a basic level, he doesn't really seem that condescending. He's pretty. Some people would say that he's uncharismatic or uninspiring, but he's pretty seems very unjudgmental, I think, in his general approach. And I don't think that's too self-conscious on his behalf. I think that's probably just who he is.
I'm really interested now. There's a few questions around this issue, and it relates to Albanese because he made a speech last week about his election would focus on women and women's needs, and he did so at a women's homeless shelter in Sydney. There's obviously been a lot of attention over the last couple of years on women's movement and on women's anger around the treatment of Brittany Higgins in Parliament, Grace Tame as Australian of the Year, and I think younger women very encouragingly to me standing up saying, enough is enough. I've been a pretty vocal part of that movement myself. It's a really interesting question, and a couple of people in the chat have put it. My colleague Matt Lloyd Cape has said, the Anglo-white Larrikin myth has been weaponized successfully, but how do we create a broader appeal without addressing that it's a bloke issue? And my friend and mentor Eva Cox has really got to the point here, that the working class male version of Australian larrikinism always excluded women. That the working class men were quite hard to bring across to accept feminism and equity. And that as we see that a working class culture and actually a typical union member now is not a bloke in a hard hat and a high-vis vest, it's a nurse or a teacher or an early childhood educator. How do we redefine our working class culture, our class culture, around the new reality of who is working class when we've got such a strong blokish Larrikin myth to overcome?
Well, yeah, it's in terms of it's very hard to change a culture. Obviously, that's why we're still dealing with this myth. I I think from a political point of view, it's just a matter of especially our parliament as a whole, but also like on the Labor Party. And the Labor Party have done a lot better job than the Liberal Party, to their credit, but is starting to reflect the diversity of the community and having people with the lived experience of these things in the parliament. Labor have done that quite successfully for women. I think that they need to do a lot more to embrace diverse people of both genders, of all genders into the parliament, and to really start to and not to pick one or the other. Like, I think that it's completely legitimate for the Labor Party to have a candidate from Central Queensland who's a coal miner, who very much fits that top bloke persona. And I think that they should also have, whether it doesn't necessarily need to be Lee herself, although I think that she was a fantastic candidate, but to have those kinds of candidates in those kinds of seats where you build up this, it's not one person, because one person can't possibly fulfill everyone's needs in modern Australia, which is such a diverse place, but it's to build up this sort of like tapestry of personas, and that within itself will start to actually reflect the complexity of modern Australian society.
Yeah. Someone in the, again, a question here, and they haven't put their name to it, but does Jacinda Ardern offer a different leadership vision that could appeal across the divide? Do you think that's possible here? And how different might it be now than 10 years ago when Julia Gillard became Prime Minister?
Oh, that was the other thing that I was going to say on the last question, was that I think that it actually has changed since Julia Gillard unfortunately went through so much shit after becoming Prime Minister. And the evidence of that, there's not, I don't think that's, I think there's still going to be issues for a long time, and we're still dealing through some of the worst of it recently. But if we look at the example of someone like Anastasia Palaszczuk, would she have been able to become the Premier of a state like Queensland without, Julia Gillard sort of going through hell before that, and making like a progress and changing people's ideas about who actually wields power and can hold those powerful positions? She's won 3 elections in what is commonly considered Australia's most conservative state, and she's an unmarried woman without kids. So I think that, and we've seen, Gladys Berejiklian, who has who hasn't survived, but I think that it again shows from a completely different political perspective that that the idea about who can lead states or who can lead countries has changed. It's just that it's a bit. I don't know if it's so much of a coincidence or a response to the last election, but we're now being led at a federal level by 2 fairly similar sort of personas, even if you accept the premise that Scott Morrison's isn't a authentic one. Like they are quite similar. They are white blokes who present themselves as ordinary rugby league loving blokes from the suburbs of Sydney. So we probably haven't had such similar leaders in recent memory, but
the last time was probably Rudd trying to be John Howard Light, but
that's probably true. And so that probably makes that can probably be a bit depressing for people, because it feels like Australian society more broadly has moved on. But I don't think that that's because I don't think that's because Australian society won't embrace those leaders. I think that that's coming, and that's inevitable.
That's encouraging. I do want to push into this a bit though, because there's the view that Morrison is, as Catherine Murphy I think has rightly said, he's micro-targeting certain blokes in the electorate that would otherwise vote Labor, to keep them as, very much the Howard Battler side on his side. He seems almost determined not to do anything for women. So everything that's been called for, they've gone halfway or stepped back. And the implementation of the Rights at Work report recently, where most of those were rejected, and yet it was still claimed as a win. And yet Albanese is quite consciously, I think, with the power of a lot of women in the Labor Party behind him, making women's issues, as they are, the centre of his campaign. So a focus on childcare and a focus on a lot of social infrastructure talking. Do you think that remains a risk for the Labor Party? Some people would say, and have said to me, that that is a risk for the Labor Party, that there's still a huge chunk of socially conservative working class Australia that sees feminism itself as a divisive issue, and that could play problematically for Albanese in the regions, even though, as you know, Anastasia Palaszczuk's won 3 terms in Queensland.
Yeah, I think it is. I think that it's a risk, but it's also a risk worth taking, and that's just needs to be done. That's sort of like one of those baseline things where you start to go like, well, what are we fighting elections for? That's just sort of needs to be part of Labor's approach, and that's why when shit was really hitting the fan for Morrison with all the Brittany Higgins stuff, he made this really bizarre appearance in the dressing sheds of a Sharks versus Eels game, and he actually appeared in the Eels dressing sheds, which isn't his team, they just won. Yeah. And he sculled a beer in the sheds, and that was one of those examples where people went, what's he doing? Like, he's such a moron. But I think that what he saw was that he was losing women voters, and so he was making a really conscious, although quite subliminal, appeal to a lot of male voters to say, who might actually still be voting Labor, to say, well, I'm sticking strong, and I'm going to protect all the privileges that you take for granted, and that and that's an electoral equation where he sees an opportunity, and so that will be really interesting to see, and I think that will just play out even on a heavier scale at the election. I think that we'll see more all these intricate shifts between the parties, and who knows who's actually going to win. But I think that the coalition will actually end up with more male voters, which is a reversal of the historical shift where the Labor Party was generally a party for men, and the Liberal Party was actually more open for women, and that's completely reversed. And I think that Morrison's rather than actually address the systemic issues within the Liberal Party, he's just gone, let's just keep on taking it to, let's just keep on trying to appeal to socially conservative men. Yeah.
Yeah. And interestingly, I think Mary Delahunty's question then comes into play here. So how do you think that Larrikin myth that he perpetuates will play in the key seats in the few states that will sadly determine the election result? Do you think it's a winning tactic this time?
Well, that's a $1 million question. I think that
predict the election outcome for us.
I think that I think that the coalition. I get frequently accused of being too optimistic about Labor's chances. So maybe
so do I.
maybe take it with a grain of salt. But I do think that the coalition vote in Western Australia and Queensland has been artificially high for quite a while now. I think that without the scare campaign that we've seen from News Corp in the past about climate change, I think they can run the same scare campaign now that they're on board with that. I don't think that's going to lead to, a complete collapse in the vote in those states, but I think that there are seats to be won just by a natural evening out of the vote, and because of what we've seen more recently through COVID in terms of the popularity of those state governments. Even if that popularity doesn't quite hold to the same extent for the next 6 months, I still think that Labor can win seats in those states. And in my home state of Queensland, a lot of those seats are quite naturally sympathetic towards Labor, but they just haven't been able to win them, and they got particularly punished in the last election because it felt like a very insider campaign. I think that the ground game in Queensland, and it might not be super clear on a national level, but they've been hammering it really hard. Albanese has been visiting central Queensland and northern Brisbane a lot, and they've picked really sort of like strategic candidates that appeal to those specific electorates. And I think that they'll really hone in on those seats that they think they can win in those resource states, and then still try and pick up potentially a couple of seats in Victoria and maybe a seat or two in Tasmania. And so I don't think there's any chance of there's not going to be a Labor landslide by any extent. But and to be honest, it's probably not the worst thing in the world that nobody thinks that Labor can win just because of what's happened historically. Like Albanese doesn't want people to think that Labor can win, because
Yeah.
it creates a sense of complacency, but it also, when voters go into, like in 2016, when nobody thought that Shorten could win, he actually got quite a good vote, and nearly pulled off an election win. And so I think that you really want voters. You don't want voters, assuming that you're going to win. You really need that sense of like being the underdog.
Yeah. Look, I've been nodding furiously there because that's my own take on the current state of play as well. And a lot of our audience, I know, are the Labor supporters that are hugely frustrated with the Labor Party and would be saying, well, where's the vision? You know, where are the big policy announcements? But of course, that's what they did last time, and it didn't work so well. And I think I agree that what we're not seeing, those of us in the bubble, in the political obsessive bubble in the cities, is that ground game that's been going on in those key marginal seats. And as much as some here might find that frustrating, you've got to win before you can do anything, right? So it's interesting. But there are a couple of questions that relate to Morrison's religion. I hate talking about politicians' religion, but I'll throw them up because a couple of people have posed it. How do you think the phrase God bothering has been used? The phrase prominent Pentecostalism has been used. How do you think that gels or otherwise with his Larrikin image?
Well, it's completely contradictory, but that's what he's a genius at, is being able to disseminate seemingly contradictory signals to completely opposed sections of the electorate. The interesting thing I will say about his religion is that, it's been a positive for him. Like, as much as progressives, and I wrote an essay about Hillsong and about Brian Houston and the connection between them. It hasn't been a negative for him at all. Partly that's because there's a big section of the electorate, and generally they're based in these outer suburban seats that are religious, that are evangelical, and that can be a really powerful social force in terms of getting people to vote, and in a way that might have been more traditionally associated with Catholics and Labor and so forth. But also the other thing is that even people who aren't even remotely religious like the idea of having someone, and this doesn't really make sense for me because I grew up in a pub and I don't have a religious bone in my body, but just a lot of people that I spoke to traveling around Queensland after the 2019 election, including my brother John, who's going to hell on any Pentecostal's judgment of morality. But he said, I don't mind having someone who's religious in power, because politicians don't believe in anything. It's actually a right to have someone there who actually believes in something. And I think that that's something that Rudd really understood and used to his advantage. So that's why long answer, but I don't think it's certainly not going to lose him an election. It's if anything, it just helps him in the seats that the coalition needs to win. It's actually a advantage.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I don't think you're wrong about that. We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to finish harking back to something you just said a little while ago, which is the shift in the News Limited papers on climate change. So that sort of negates that as a scare campaign to some extent. Also economic management, which the Prime Minister would like to run on. Well, they've just been the biggest spending government in history and we're in massive amounts of debt. So the debt and deficit framework's not as compelling as it was either. And while that might seem like good, those are two things that are gone, that are false debates, that are gone from our public discourse. Maybe we can have an election fought on the real issues. My concern, and I wonder how much this is just me being pessimistic, Lex, so feel free to tell me yes or no, is that all that will leave the government with is culture wars, and that we're likely to see a more divisive election because those two issues that you're either concerned or not about climate change, and everyone's concerned about economic management. What, in the absence of those, is the Larrikin Prime Minister likely to pick on? And seeing in the last few days his rhetoric about can-do capitalism on the one hand and the forces of government trying to control you on the other, is that going to be the kind of divisive framework that we're going to see for the next 6 months?
Yeah, I think that will be part of the frame. I also think that this is China's coming in from sort of stage right to become this totemic issue for the coalition, and that was an example of where I think that Albanese, in terms of him putting his head down at certain times, was really smart the other day when Morrison was goading him and was accusing him of being unpatriotic and so forth. And initially I was like, how is Albanese not like launched, defended himself or responded? And his response was simply, I've got no idea what the guy's talking about. It was sort of just that bemused type thing. And which didn't make any sense to me. And then I was thinking about it and I was like, it's actually really smart to not get drawn into this sort of stuff, because if he had have launched a patriotic defense of himself as an Australian and defended himself from the charge of being a Chinese co-conspirator with China, that would have been leading the news that night. It would have put into people's heads who weren't even thinking about the issue of his patriotism, that he has something to defend. And so there is going to be Morrison's shown that he, even without these issues, he's going to try every trick in the book, and he's very good at sounding very convincing while he does that. So there's going to be a heap of stuff, but I think that the trick to that for Labor will not get over emotional, especially the politicians who are in the firing line, to not get over emotional and to sort of pick their moments and not fight on the coalition's sort of playbook all the time, because otherwise they start to look like that they've got something to hide because they're repeating all these Liberal Party talking points. And so yeah, it'll be interesting.
It certainly will. And for all of our audience, if you haven't read Lech's essay as yet, do so. Not only will it give you some insight into the current political environment, but I think beyond that, it's a really informed and original take on class and identity in Australia. And it's also really funny, which you don't always get from a QE. So it's a lot of laughs in this essay as well. It's a really good read. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a really
thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. It's been a great chat.
Sort of feel like we've scratched the surface and we could go much further, but maybe we'll get you back next year before the election and have another chat.
That'd be awesome. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And look, for all of our audience, thank you for joining us. These hours always go far too quickly. Our next event is on Monday week, the 29th in the evening, I think. And that's with Fiona McLeod on her essay, Easy Lies and Influence. Please join us for that if you haven't registered already. And then our next Wednesday event in 3 weeks' time, that's with Sean Kelly about his book, The Game, which is another fascinating look at our Prime Minister and an interesting piece to read alongside Lech's essay as well. And then our last event for the year will be on the 15th of December. That's with Van Badham on her book QAnon and On. And they will take us almost up to Christmas. So we will be announcing our series of events for next year very shortly. And we'll also have an announcement on a big per capita, hopefully in-person event in February in Canberra. So keep an eye out for all of that as well. But again, thank you, Lech, for joining us. Thank you for your contribution to our public debate. It's, as I said at the outset, the work of people like you and Rick Norton and others that are, bringing a fresher perspective, and I think a really original take on some of our tired decades-old public debates is something that for this middle-aged woman has been really inspiring. So thanks very much. And thank you.
No worries at all.
Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.